But then he wanted me to know, look, there are things that I need to do in your life that you won't understand, and you don't need to know why or what I'm doing. Just trust me. And to get me to that point was not easy, because my soul really found its identity in knowledge and wisdom, and therefore not to know was just cruel. I thought, it just felt like, this is so cruel. You made me needing to know stuff and wanting to know stuff, and now you're not wanting me to know it. And I'm, oh, that's really hard, because it had to get my identity had to not come from that. Even though that was part of me, doing it didn't create my identity. My identity came from him.
It's the question of the heart, this journey that I've been on for the past 9 years with the Father, and building relationship, and realizing that a lot of what has been going on is dealing with the issues of my heart, so that I can be more effective in living out destiny. And but it's always highlighted the relationship with Father. And so I'm so grateful for that, because that I realize that's what my heart's been crying out for my whole life. And Father has shown me that it's possible. And so my question is, Mike, is how powerful is our declarations if it's not coming from the issue of my heart being pure, and God cleansing me of the blockages and this and that in the relationship with Father. There's a lot of declarations, there's a lot of things, but
Yeah. Okay. I would say there's limited power towards other people and other things that we can declare if we're not coming out of the heart of God. If we're coming out of the heart of God and our heart is not totally pure, then God is going to respect his heart, so he honors that. Obviously, none of us are 100% totally sorted out in every way. We have bad days sometimes. Things happen. So from that perspective, I believe God honors that which we are looking to align with his heart, even if our motive is not 100% pure. It's still his heart, and he will honor that which is his heart. I think the more our heart is purified, and the more we're like him, the more he will reveal to him of his heart, to us of his heart. So we'll get to know his heart in a more intimate and a deeper way. And sometimes in the past, God has shown me what he's doing, but the more intimate I get, he reveals why he's doing it as well. So not just the heart of the Father, but also why the Father is doing what he's doing, for what reason. So sometimes that's bigger picture things that you can't always see. And the more, I think, purified our hearts are, the more he will reveal himself to us, and the more his heart is unveiled to us in that way. If we are operating totally in opposition to his heart, I believe the level of authority we have in that is usually towards us or our spheres. So, if I start making declarations that I have no sense of authority to, the end of the day, and they're contradictory to God's heart, I don't believe they have any effect at all. Because really, we're just declaring things from our own heart. Now, if I'm declaring something to my own heart towards me, then I do think that has a measure of authority, in that if I'm declaring negativity, if I'm sort of focusing on the negative that I feel about myself, or I'm declaring, worthlessness over myself, there's a sense where I am hearing myself, and that I have authority in that sphere. Therefore, I think it does have an effect. I don't believe the effect is sovereign. in the, if I'm declaring over myself death and destruction and whatever, you know, I think there's a limit to which that has authority to kill me. But I think there is often an accumulative effect. So the more negativity you sow and the more you believe it and the more you sow it and the more you feel it, then I think that can ultimately cause fear, the things you fear to come upon you and things like that. It's a sort of sowing and reaping dynamic, but that has effect more in our own lives and our spheres of influence rather than other people, you know. So a curse without a cause won't alight. So if I curse people, but there's no cause for that curse, then it is meaningless. But if there is something that that curse attaches itself to, then it may have a measure of negativity towards that person because of the link to whatever that curse is affecting their lives with, because of what they might be believing themselves, or maybe what they're up to themselves. So, it's a complicated thing, and I don't think anyone knows. So the safest thing is to err on be kind, good, loving towards yourself and other people. So love one another as he's loved us, but also loved our neighbors as ourselves. So if we tie it all up with love, then whatever we're declaring is going to be covered in love. And if we're declaring things which are aligned to love, then we can't go wrong, because God is love. So from that perspective, I don't think we need to be concerned. So the more we know God, the more we know his love, the more we realize that's unconditional, the more we're likely to be unconditional towards ourselves and other people.
Yes.
That's only going to have a positive effect, So if I, go to my mountain in heaven and start declaring, you know, the destruction of the moon or something, it's going to have no effect, because God is heart is not for the moon to be destroyed, and I don't have any authority over the moon. So at the end of the day, that's not going to have any effect at all. Um, Now, I
So,
also, but then along with that, if you get together with other people and you join together with other people, I think there can be an accumulative effect, both positively and negatively, when there's agreement with others over negativity. I think then that can potentially have an effect, but I think there's still a limit. We can't make declarations for the destruction of the universe and it's going to happen, because it isn't going to happen, because God has already decreed the restoration of the universe and creation. So you can't really go against the decrees that God has already made, but the negativity that we have would influence the outworking of those decrees, because we are a part of that. So if we refuse to accept our responsibility for creation, then it's going to slow down the restoration of creation. But it's not going to affect ultimately its restoration. It may just affect the timescale of it, in that we're involved. And the more of us that are involved, I think that will have a greater effect in terms of restoring creation in that way. But yeah.
so when I was in the church world, I was a big part of the prayer
Mm.
setting. And that was one of the first things that I asked Father, when I first started this journey, is what is prayer?
Mm.
And I basically got the one word, and it was agreement with his heart. It was
Yeah.
always in the agreement with his heart. And so I've this journey
Mm.
I've built my relationship with him and
Mm.
around that.
I mean, when you think of prayer, we used to pray for things that we wanted, or pray for people that we thought we were praying the right things for. But most of the time we were just praying things generally out of what we thought, bless this
For our
person.
own desire.
Yeah, I mean, often without, because we didn't know God's heart for that person, therefore we were praying in general, bless
Right,
that person. If that person, something's negative going on, protect them or heal them or restore them or whatever it might be. Help them out of that situation they're in.
right.
That might not always be the best thing for somebody. They may be in a situation that God is using to teach them to overcome, or whatever it might be. Now, I don't believe God ever uses sickness in a negative sense. You know, he doesn't bring sickness upon people to use that sickness, but he will still bring something good out of people's sickness if they have it. So I think
Yeah.
that's the key when we're looking to engage with God's heart in agreement. Um, it's always going to be something which is coming to operate out of love, you know. Therefore, if I suddenly start praying for things, you know, because someone's done something or whatever, and I'm praying against that person, that's never going to be the heart of God, you know, or remove that person from this or do this. You know, if it's not loving, not filled with grace and mercy, then I don't think it has any power, real power.
Right. I totally agree. And to me, what I learned even in the church world is that that was witchcraft praying or soul force praying, projecting my own will, which, is praying out
Yeah.
of my own head. And
Now, I
so,
think sometimes when something negative happens that someone has prayed for, yeah, okay, well, why did that happen? That wasn't God's heart, but the person may have come into agreement with it.
right,
And if the person comes into agreement with something negative that you're praying, that still has an effect.
right.
You know, it may not
Yes,
be in agreement with God, but we can be agreement with others and certainly with another person and they may receive because they may already be believing something negative. So if
right,
you affirm that negativity, they're in agreement with it, well, then that could have an effect on their situation.
right. And that's as I processed with Father the different ones that have passed, and it made me wonder if there was some type of agreement in place that, or some type of legal access, to
Yeah,
that,
yeah.
because I've been before Father, I'm just constantly, and I'm wondering if this is going to ever stop. And maybe I'm hoping that I'll come to a place of just being living instead of having to deal with the issues of my heart. But maybe that's going to be ongoing. But my next question, Mike, and you can elaborate with this, is when you carry someone in your heart,
Mm.
you know, that to me, that is the form of praying without ceasing. But I also know that that has stipulations to it. I can't have unforgiveness or attitudes or judgments or criticism towards, if it's even my son or daughter or husband or whomever I'm carrying, that nullifies those prayers. They're not, and help me to understand what that process is going on when I am carrying them.
Um, and I think it's a terminology that it's almost like, okay, what does it mean to carry someone? Well, I am turning my attention to that person for good, for blessing, for whatever it might be. And when I go and engage the Father, it's like I'm carrying my heart for them with to him to engage his heart for them. So I come into agreement with because I'm engaging them with him, which I think is really what we're talking about. Well, I'm carrying them in my heart. I think you have to have some measure of relationship to do it. I don't think I can just pick someone randomly and say, oh, I'm going to carry them into my heart when I've got no relationship with them. It may be that God can give me permission to do that when he sort of says, hey, there's someone here I want you to engage with, and I want you to minister to. I think that's something that can happen. But really, carrying them in my heart is I'm giving them a place in my emotions and in my desires for their blessing. That's really what it's talking about. You know, I'm focused. You know, I might completely be forgetting about a whole load of people. Well, I'm not carrying them in my heart because they don't have that place where my focus and intention is for their blessing. I may randomly pray for them sometimes or think about them or, sometimes feel compassion about some people and different situations, but that's different from actually focused intention for that person, which means my heart is set towards them, and sometimes, it's like there's a lady who I know who I engage with. who's not well at the moment, and one of her relatives contacted me and say, can you pray for her? And you know, in general, of course, I will say yes, but the level in which I can pray for that person depends on the level of either God empowering me or that I carry the desire for them. And in this situation, I've been meeting for this person for quite a while. I have a heart for her. I regularly, carry her in my heart for her wholeness and everything else. So from this situation, it's like, yes, I can definitely say I'm in agreement with you for her healing, for her to be restored, for that. Now, I can't make that happen. I can't override where she is. Now, in this situation, was in ICU, she's been sedated, whatever. So I'm engaging her spirit. So when someone says to me, well, can you pray for her? I'm not just going to say, oh God, can you get her out of this situation? I'm engaging her spirit. I'm calling her spirit to rise up. I'm calling her spirit to maybe override some of her soul's emotions that she might be feeling in this situation: despair, despondency. Oh, I'm going to give up, blah, blah, blah. I want her spirit to rise up so her spirit can stand firm and her spirit can be agreement with me and others for her healing and wholeness. Now there's only an amount that I can do. I can't make that happen, but I can do what I can do, and therefore there would be agreement with a relative. But sometimes I do know quite a lot about where this lady is, and I know sometimes she's quite negative about herself and struggles with her own thinking in that whole area. So I know, if that's the state that her mind is in, that needs to change so that she is in alignment with how God thinks about her for her to come into health and wholeness. Otherwise, she's going to be focusing on the negative, and that's going to be negative effectively. So it's always difficult when you're not just dealing with yourself, because I don't know what's going on in someone else's heart, and at that point when someone dies or whatever, I don't know what their agreement was and where they were at that moment. I don't know. And I can't override anybody's choice
No,
by
I
my
agree with
desire.
that.
But I am looking for their spirit to maybe bring positive influence on their soul's choices, because the spirit does have the full capacity of our true identity, and therefore can have a powerful influence. But sometimes, when the soul is, let's say, sleeping, or when the soul is in a state of sedation, and therefore I don't know what's going on subconsciously, but usually the conscious mind may be not focusing and be able to focus itself. I think the spirit can have an effect in that way. And and I can look to engage their angels and do there's things you can do, but it's not a magic wand, and you can't just turn a situation around like that. Now, some people would do court cases for that dynamic. Is there a legal right here in their life? Can I do a court case on their behalf if they're sedated and can't do one for themselves? Yeah, I have done that, and I've done that corporately with others. But there's still a degree that when that person is able to engage, they still have to deal with their accusations themselves. And if there is a true accusation and they don't change, then that's just going to continue to give the enemy some sort of legal access to their lives.
Right.
Yeah.
So that would be the tie-in to my next question. Recently I had a prophetic word, and I don't look for those anymore. They're, it's not something I'm going before the Father in relationship myself. And so I'm allowing him to reveal and do and whatever the process is at the time, this prophetic word, it made me, you know, not resist it, but it was like, I felt like my level of responsibility towards it, what was being said, didn't excuse that, you know, meaning it had to do with healing, and my level of responsibility towards continuing this process of walking out my inheritance, allowing Father to see me in the finished work, already healed, you know, all those things that I've learned from you and from sitting with the Father. And so when that was, so yes, what they said was true. You know, they basically picked up a bench of 3 that was in operation, a negative bench. And I did look back through my life and saw that there were some traumatic things that were set in place that has been blocking the manifestation of the healings that Father wants me to walk in. And but it also, it was like, it was all the way I processed it. It was like old school, because I didn't want to excuse my responsibility towards Father with it. So I've been processing with the Father what was said, and you know, they're just a delivery. They just delivered the message. That's another thing, is I don't want to give glory to man. I want to give glory to God in this situation, and I sense that it's, you know, and I'm pretty much over that.
Yeah, I mean, prophetic words. When I look back over my life and I look at most of the words that were spoken, I believe most of those words were positive words, but words out of the person's desire to be positive and nice. How many of them were directly from God? Not that many. Looking back, you know, they were nice. Oh, that's nice. But then when I knew, there were several words that I knew were God, and I totally resonated, was in complete agreement with that word, there was a different weight to the authority that that word carried. And usually God, the way the person said something, the phraseology they used often triggered that response in me, because I knew. Like several people said, yeah, God has seen your heart. That's how they started. And I immediately knew what was in my heart towards things I was seeking God for. And if they came out with, oh, God has seen your heart, blah, 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 and I just like, what? Yeah, I would have known that actually that wasn't God. But actually it was. And the number, just the few times that that was said, God has seen your heart, I knew that what was coming was going to be from God. And I still weighed it. I still read it, looked at it or heard it and weighed it. And yes, that is from God. Because actually God was responding to my heart, and that person was open to be able to speak on behalf of God to me in situations which were very much direction changing situations, or get ready preparations. God has seen your heart, now get ready, it's coming. And actually one of those words affirmed, you know, when I went on my fast in 2010, the 40-day fast, God had spoken to me about that, but a person had sent me a letter with a prophetic word in it, and it said, you know, God has seen your heart, and this is going to happen. What you seek, a door is open in heaven, blah, blah, blah. You know, and I'm like, yeah, that is totally in agreement. So when God said 40-day fast, that prophetic word came up. And actually, I went back and looked at it, and on the envelope, in very, very tiny pen or pencil, it said, pray this once a day for 40 something days,
Goodness.
which was effectively, or read this or agree with it or declare it, whatever, for 4. And it was like, yeah, God get. So when I went into the 40-day fast, I took that word and I used it as a reminder of this is what God has said to me. So for the first 18 days of that fast, when I was just going through fire virtually, that word give me strength to hang in there, because yes, God has promised. God has
Yeah.
promised. And
Yes.
therefore, some of those words were really encouraging, whatever else. Most of the general words that, I would in a meeting or someone would pray over me or whatever, it was like, oh, yeah, that's nice, but
Mm,
I didn't feel it carried any sense of God speaking to me. But the person was sharing their heart's desire to bless me, and that's all
mm,
nice. There's nothing wrong in that.
mhm.
But I think there are some things where you need, there's a weight to this. Now, very few, I mean, sometimes I would be hoping someone would pray a word which was like, God has seen your heart and this is in there and he wants to deal with it. But no one ever said that to me. Never, no one. I was sometimes like, oh, I was going through some difficult times or struggling with stuff. It'd be almost like, oh, come on. If you really are a prophet, you should know what's going on inside of me. And no one ever said it. And I would have been very happy if they'd been like, yeah, because God really, he's going to bring about change and transformation in this situation or whatever. But no, it was generally, very positive things.
Yeah.
People would
Well,
pray.
I've always heard that that a prophet is not supposed to highlight the negative. They see
Well,
the negative, but to highlight
uh,
it, to share, most people don't want to deal with it. They want to hear the good.
maybe, but I was open for them to. It was almost like, I know the struggles are in my heart. It would be really good to hear that God was, in on encouraging me to get that sorted, or that was going to be sorted. I wouldn't have had a problem with that, but mostly didn't. Now, you could say, well, they may have felt they didn't have permission to share it, or they just may have felt uncomfortable sharing it. You know,
Right.
like if there was a warning from God, I'd want to hear it. You know what I mean?
Well, yeah, in
You
that
know,
sense. I've heard, it's funny in this realm that I am now with the Father. I think of many prophetic words that were given to me, and I see them in a totally different perspective.
yes,
I mean, it's like that's what that meant. What has nothing to do with, what
yeah,
I thought back then, and it's actually a beautiful thing that happens with me. Uh,
yeah.
just
And
here
I
recently,
think sometimes people bring a word from God and then they add their bit to it and try and explain it or embellish it, or you know and I don't think prophets are often the best people to interpret what they're prophesying.
right?
They're
It's like the
already going
dreamer,
to have a preconceived idea to the meaning. And I
right?
think that's the problem with the prophetic movement even now. Prophesying a whole load of politicized stuff, I think it's coming out of their own heart and their own way of thinking, to be honest. I don't think it's from God at all. But
Well, that
they are still prophesying and they're seen as prophets. But I mean, I think it was the in last year, middle of the year, some people, they said, okay, we're gonna take a whole bunch of prophetic words that were given by very well-known prophets for the coming year, and we're gonna just sort of see if any of them have been fulfilled. And there were some that were so woolly you could probably find a fulfillment in anything, because sometimes they're just so open-ended, you could look anywhere and see a fulfillment. But there were those who were very specific. Nearly none of them were fulfilled. And I think people have got used to these words. And some of them, like, the word for 90, 25, come alive in 25 is usually some sort of rhyme or catchphrase with it. And to be honest, I think majority of those words are pretty meaningless. I think they're just, hey, oh yeah, let's be positive about 25, or let's, you know, or actually some maybe next be negative about 25. But to be honest, I just don't resonate with them at all. And you
Yeah,
get them every year, coming to the end of the year or beginning of a new year, people start coming out with this and oh, this is the year of so and so, and you know, or then they'll tag on the Jewish date to it, and this is the Jewish calendar for the year of this, and the numbers mean this, you know, and it's just like, well, which Jewish calendar are you using? Because there's several, and they have different ways of looking at the, you know, the return from exile to date the calendar. You know, it's just like, well, okay, to me that's just, it's just pop prophecy, you know, as I call it. It doesn't mean anything particularly, you know. And then there's the prophetic words that they get totally wrong, but I've very, very rarely heard anybody come back and say I got it wrong. Yeah.
yeah. I've heard you speak of that before. That's so true. Now, when I did have this prophetic word where I have uh, taken your teaching and I work the altar of sacrifice in my life, I'm able to discern more when things are amiss in others. Not that I
Yeah.
highlight it or, you know, but I do use it to be more cautious and careful in relationships and that sort of thing. So I did hear some motive in this prophetic word, and that I had to process that with the Father. You know, I did hear that mixture in this, and so it's okay. I worked through it and was able to uh, get in Father's heart and pray about that need that I was hearing. But um, the one thing I was going to say about the prophetic is I don't seek after that anymore. It's not, you know, I'm working a relationship with the Father. So I don't try not to tune into any of it. I I listen to Fiorella whenever she's posting things on Facebook. I'll, you know, see if there's anything Father wants me to pay attention to or highlight, just as I do Justin. And there's not a lot that I follow anymore. You know, once you've tasted the best being in relationship with the Father, you know, that's been your whole goal in mentoring us. And I'm very, very grateful for that. But I know it's an everyday, ongoing relational connection that
Absolutely, yeah. And there's lots of things that God said to me that I had no idea about when he said it. I thought I might have an idea about it, but to be honest, then you look back and in hindsight you think, oh, yeah, that's what that was about. And I really didn't, because my level of understanding at that time was not such that I could have understood it. But God was saying it to inspire me that when the time came, then I could resonate with, oh, yeah, you know, or he's added several other things to it over the passage of time. And now I get it because actually, that links to this and links to that. And that's happened lots of times, you know. So I don't, just because God says something, I'm also careful not to just assume that I understand the full meaning of what he said. And if I'm unsure, I go back to him, and sometimes he'll, you know, expand on it, and other times the time is not right to expand on it then. So that's okay. If he's silent, then I accept, you know, I put it on the back burner and wait, you know,
I,
you know. But he said lots of things that had multiple meanings, different levels of meaning. So the surface meaning I might have thought I understood, but then there were several other levels, you know, that was like, okay, like what I think 2017, God said, you know, prepare for a shift. There's 3 years. Do you have to prepare for a great shift coming? And I'm like, oh, what's that? You know, and I was expecting something or some things, or I might have thought about certain things, but actually in relation to what actually happened in the after 3 years, I had no idea at all what that might be, both personally, globally, you know. There was so many levels to that word that I needed to get ready for a shift. Um, that now I look back and think, wow, there's no way I could have, you know. And the preparation wasn't me trying to okay, I'm going to get ready. And it was more, get your heart right. So when something happens, your heart will be right towards it, you know, and, and that was the case. And when I now look back and see all that happened in 2020, it was like, whoa, there was so many shifts, both personal, ministry, global, and God was saying, now I carried that for 3 years. It was like, okay, if there's a shift coming, do what you need to do in my heart so that I'm ready for this shift. I didn't say to him, tell me what the shift is. Initially that was the sort of, oh, I wonder what this shift is. But actually my heart was, okay, if God's not telling me, then I just want him to do whatever he needs to do so my heart is right for whenever happens, that I can be ready for it at the time. And, and now I look back and can see, that God was, not warning me, but just saying, hey, I know what's coming.
Preparing.
Prepare you. I'll
Yes.
prepare you for what's coming. Just keep walking
Yes.
with me. Yeah.
Father's done that in many instances.
Mm.
Before my mother had passed away, he told me a year beforehand, and I had preparation that whole year in all the areas of letting go of a loved one.
Yeah.
And so, most people do not understand your process when this is going on. And here recently, I have felt to let go of one of my calls. I try not to, I'm not addicted to the calls by no means. And if, I try to find Father's mandate and purpose in it, as we all know, our time is valuable. And, to me, I just rather sit with Father than, but iron sharpens iron, and I know I need to connect with others, but this one in particular, it was all part of preparation. I believe Father, well, he used the word, come away, my beloved.
Mm.
It was personal. It probably didn't even have to do with the call in a roundabout way, because Father never highlights the negative, but he did use circumstances to
Yeah.
make me aware of, and actually you wrote it in your book, and I felt like Father was confirming it when you said you were being called into the dark cloud and being prepared for that, and how Father was showing you to be very careful who is in your life. You only want people, the environment you want to be safe. And
Yeah.
so, if people are not for you, then they're against you. And it doesn't matter what words are being used, it's the issues of the heart. And that's what I started this question with you about, is I'm realizing how important the issues of our heart is. My whole existence is what's going on in my heart. And Father has used these past 9 years to remove blockages and hindrances and lies and mindsets and beliefs, all those things that you've taught as I've walked with Father. And he continues, I'm continually in that process with him, some level, some way. And, I realize how rebellion and stubbornness, you know, that is such a serious block. And I've worked through a lot of it, and I probably have a lot more to work through. But I want a pure heart. I want the effectiveness of the power that Father has given us for other people, for my destiny, existence on the earth, and being on the earth, staying on the earth, but for His glory. I want to glorify my Father and honor, uh, this work that He's doing in me. And so I don't know what my next question is. It's the issues of the heart. Sometimes I think I overthink things, and I'm too intense about things. And I've dealt with the striving. I've dealt with the uh, pressing, and
I think surrender is the key. You know,
yes,
that was what I found. God brought me to the point of surrender where I stopped trying to sort it out myself. I stopped needing to know what God was doing to trust him. And that was a huge thing, to get to the point where, no, I trust you when I don't understand. It's easy to trust God when you do understand, because, oh yeah, but then he wanted me to know look, there are things that I need to do in your life that you won't understand, and you don't need to know why or what I'm doing. Just trust me. And to get me to that point was not easy, because my soul really found its identity in knowledge and wisdom, and therefore not to know was just cruel. I thought, it just felt like, this is so cruel. You made me needing to know stuff and wanting to know stuff, and now you're not wanting me to know it. And I'm, oh, that's really hard, because it had to get my identity had to not come from that. Even though that was part of me, doing it didn't create my identity. My identity came from him. And that was so hard, and he had to take me through a whole process to get me to that point where I truly surrendered. And then it was like, oh, now he then started to be able to do things that I wouldn't have even imagined. And certainly the deconstruction process really started in earnest after I surrendered, and I didn't need to know or figure it out or understand it for him to affirm it. And that was such a life-changing time. um and how many times that I'd said I surrender before that? Loads of times. The old hymn, I surrender all. I know how many times I've sung that in my life, and I meant it, but I didn't know the level of surrender that God required. It's easy to say I surrender all, and you mean it, but you can't mean it until your soul actually comes into alignment with the surrender. And that's eventually what happened, but it was traumatic to my soul, but ultimately brought me to a place where I was able to engage God at a level that it was impossible to before, and that God was able then to show me things beyond anything I could have possibly imagined or thought. And I look back and think, I'm so grateful that he took me through that process and brought me to the point of surrender. Everything, and for me, it was so hard to get to that point, but he knew what I needed. And therefore, when I came at the end, not only did I know that I trusted him, I knew that he trusted me, which was also joyous in a sense. It felt, wow. Now that didn't mean that I didn't need a whole load more stuff sorting out. In fact, that was just the catalyst to begin deconstruction, because now I trusted God, and I began then to experience unconditional love. Because until I got to that point in surrender, I couldn't experience unconditional love, because I felt love was earned, or God loved me when I was doing the right stuff. But deep down, there was this little voice that was, well, if you don't do the right stuff, so keep doing it, keep doing what's good, doing what's right. But the motive for that was not right. It was out of fear and not out of love. So as soon as I got to that point of true surrender, then I began to experience unconditional love in ways that I couldn't do before. And then that then enabled me to see who God really is as love.
Yes.
Which totally changed my whole perspective of God, and therefore how God deals with people and what God does, and all of the stuff that was deconstructed by experiencing unconditional love, and then realizing that God does not have favorites, and God does not treat people differently. He treats everyone the same. And that means, the abuser and the abused, God loves the same. That's not fair. From a man's mindset of man, that's not justice. But from God's cross-based view of what Jesus did, that is total justice, because he died for everybody.
Yes.
Not just a limited number of people who would come into agreement with it, but everybody. So that really facilitated my understanding and experience of God at just so many depths of levels after that, when I got to surrender. Yeah.
Well, that's good, Mike. Thank you. I it makes me wonder. I surrender constantly. I start my session with him surrendering, and I'm experiencing some of what you're saying, but I am also feeling that there's even more in me experiencing surrender.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think I've surrendered since, or even needed to surrender since, because it was no, this is it. Now, I've agreed with God since, and when he's challenged me in beliefs, I agree with you. I can't really, how do I ever believe that before? But the actual point of surrender was something which was a total change, in that my soul's relationship with God and my spirit changed through that act of surrender, that true surrender. And then from that point, I didn't need to surrender again. What I did is engage God at a deeper level. And that meant he showed me all the different belief systems that I had, which were wrong, but there was no condemnation with it. You see, if I had not experienced that level of surrender and then unconditional love and no judgment, then I would have not trusted God in the future, because I would have struggled with my beliefs, and to admit that I was wrong would have been, you're a failure. That carries condemnation and carries shame, whereas there was no shame or guilt or condemnation with God showing me something, and it's, oh yeah, I'm just so wrong. But no fear, and and the going before the judgment seat and engaging my scroll and finding the fire of his eyes purify it. There was just no guilt, no shame, no condemnation, just surrender. And it was the surrender I did was outworked over and over again, but I never needed to do it again. It just meant that I was in a place where God could continue that transformation process, and particularly in deconstruction of belief systems, and me experiencing him as he really is, rather than as I thought he was. And that was life transforming, but it took a dark cloud to get me to that point where he separated my soul and spirit, and that really meant my orientation towards God and my spirit to completely changed. And then I didn't fight or resist or struggle when the process continued. I was in agreement with it and happy for it.
Yes, welcoming it for
Yeah.
the change.
Yeah.
Well, one of the processes that I'm working with Father in right now is, it's been brought to my attention that possibly that my father, he passed away when I was 2 years old,
Right.
and that it could have been intentional,
Mm.
like suicidal.
Yeah.
And so I've been asking Father if there's something that I need to do in the spirit. Did that set something up in the generational line that needs to be dealt with? Because I see a lot of
Mm.
what I see in my generational line is a lot of death structures, as I'm dealing with immortality and
Cool.
decay and death
Okay.
and
Well, at the end of the day, if the Father shows you something, then yeah, you can deal with it. It's not automatic. Um, but the question would be, why did he do it? What was going on in his mind? And, from that perspective, can that have an effect? Well, you were already two, so epigenetically, no, because it wouldn't passed on genetically or epigenetically to you. But it's certainly worth asking the question. And you can always go and visit him and see him wherever he is. If he's in the cloud of witnesses, go and engage him. If he's not, go and preach to him. You know.
out of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
So see, So is epigenetics only passed on? Highlight, share that
Well,
with me.
epigenetic factors are factors of behavior that are passed on to the next generation, but they can't be passed on just spiritually. It's not like, oh, well, they're only before birth. They're not after birth. It's like what my, say, father did after birth could not be passed on to me attached to my genetic material. Because
Okay.
epigenetics is an attachment of sulfonated groups to the genetic material. It's not our gene sequencing, which makes up, what we look like and all of that, but it's an effect. So let's say your father was an alcoholic, that could be passed on epigenetically, not genetically, but epigenetically, because it's a behavioral system. So a lot of people can have behavioral factors passed on to them through genetic material, but not through genes, if you like. So the behaviors, and that can happen within one generation. So a parent, something happens, that can be passed on to the child because it affects their epigenetic factors, and that can be passed on. So they've done a lot of psychological research into epigenetics to see certain traits that are passed on, and they do it. Don't start off in humans. They obviously usually start off in mice or something like that, and they sort of do certain things which are behavioral programming to the parent, and then when there's offspring, they have that programming. Well, it didn't change their genetic material, but it was attached to their genetic material that some way then influenced the offspring. And I think there's a sense where that can happen. Uh, Genetic transformation or mutation takes a long time, whereas this can be instant. It can affect the genetic material epigenetically instantly and then passed on to the next generation, but not once that generation has already been born.
Okay.
Because it can't be attached to they have to do it. Now, programming can, in a sense, behavioral example, nurture, can then cause a person to respond out of seeing their parents and then behaving like them, that then can also then be attached to them and becomes an epigenetic factor in them, which could be passed on to the next generation. But they did that by creating their own epigen because they're following the example of a parent, which can happen. Or sometimes you can get negative judgment on a parent, and what you judge can come upon you. Bitter root judgment is called. And if you bitter root judgment a parent over something and you don't forgive them, that can cause that to come upon you. And certain people, like, they've judged their parents for alcoholism, and then they have been drawn to alcohol in their life, not because it was epigenetic, but because of the judgment.
Mm.
So it's complex. These sort of issues of nature, nurture, they're sort of complex issues um, that do affect people. Nurture. I mean, you can take two twins, identical twins, and separate them at birth, and there'll be some things that are epigenetic and they will be exactly the same. And there are some things, one is brought up in a very rich home, one's brought up in poverty, that would have an effect on the way they thought, how their belief systems were. A lot of issues are nurture as opposed to nature, and some are nature as well. you know so it does have a sort of these influences that
Mhm.
God can undo. That's where taking communion and dealing with the sort of the effect that there may be in our genetic material, but also within our epigenetic material, and actually see that we are new creations in Christ, that needs to renew our minds and bring us into alignment with who we really are, and not believe the lies of what we thought we were or who we thought we were. If you enjoy these videos, would you please take a moment to like, comment, and subscribe? It really does help. Thank you very much.